Okay, let's see how this goes. This is the first lecture on this unit on the problem of evil. I really like this particular unit, not just because it has some very important considerations with regard to our ideas about an all-powerful, all-good entity and how well that really fits with the nature of the universe, but the kinds of arguments that people have used in order to try and deal with this problem. There's quite a few of them out there, and I think that makes them, and they're very interesting. So it's an opportunity to get to see a whole range of different kinds of arguments in just one kind of a unit. So the problem of evil, very classic, very old. This is a particularly poetic version. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? This is described in the literature, so to speak. It was called the Epicurean paradox and was attributed to Epicurus by Diogenes Laertius in his book, The Lives of the Philosophers. I don't think this is consistent, however, with what Epicurus himself believed or seemed to espouse to his students. And but it is a lovely poetic reading, relatively speaking. It gets to the center of the idea and does what it needs to do. Okay. Sometimes I use this as an opportunity to talk about Epicurus, but I think I'm going to be able to get in a unit on Epicurus later. Okay, so here is the problem of evil. This is the one, no, not yet. So if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, then why does evil exist? And omni, of course, is all. I think it's Latin. Potens comes as power, powerful. Benevolent is to be good, and scientia is knowledge in this context. So if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why does evil exist? Because, of course, if God is all-good, God doesn't want evil and suffering to exist. And if God is all-powerful, then God can get rid of all possible evil and suffering. And if God is all-knowing, God knows about all the evil and suffering and how to be able to get rid of it. So, but yet it continues to exist. Evil. Not sure about the God part. I have asked you to read a particular piece by a guy by the name of John Leslie Mackie, J.L. Mackie. He was an Australian philosopher. He was also very well known for, he did some fine work in metaphysics and logic, in analytic philosophy in general, in addition to his, this particular piece on the problem of evil. He was a moral skeptic generally. He did not believe that morality actually exists. But this was kind of a sideline for him as far as his actual, day-to-day work went. This is just something he sort of spun off on the side. But as readings go for the problem of evil, it's a really good one. That's why I selected for you to read. So this is J.L. Mackie's version of the problem of evil. Number one, so these are the premises. And I don't think the conclusion is actually here. One, God is omnipotent, right? God is all-powerful. God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. And Mackie goes on to define what he means by what it means for something to be good, right? Good is opposed to evil. For example, a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. And he defines omnipotence as there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. This is a very strong kind of statement, these two ideas about goodness and eliminating evil as far as it can, and there being no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. Later on, we're going to take a look at people sort of manipulating what omnipotence might actually mean. That maybe omnipotence doesn't quite mean what we think it does. We might be mistaken. Alvin Plantinga, he's still around, a prominent theologian, a 20th century theologian. He pointed out that this argument ultimately fails because there's some assumed premises in this argument that are not as obviously correct as what Mackie has already stated. So it's not a proper contradiction, right? It seems to be a contradiction because if God is all good and God is all powerful, why does evil exist, right? The first two would seem to imply that evil ought not exist in a universe that is composed, maintained by an all good, all powerful entity. So it's not quite a proper contradiction in Plantinga's version because there's a couple of other unstated premises in there. He doesn't specify exactly what these premises are, and J.L. Mackie agreed with Plantinga that really this argument isn't airtight, as it were, watertight, that there are problems with it, but he says the fundamental idea still stands, even if there are some logical problems with this particular argument. All right, so there are two particular arguments that or really three arguments that he finds to be adequate solutions to the problem of evil. One of them is to argue that maybe God isn't all good. Maybe God isn't all good, but, sometimes has bad days, right? Some days, God gets up on the wrong side of whatever is that God would, sleep on. But so God isn't consistently good all of the time. But it seems to be a profoundly important part of all of our ideas of God and why we worship, God, at least in the sort of Western European, Judeo-Islamic Christian faiths, broadly painted, that they seem to require that God be all good to be, part of why justifies our worship of God. So but if you were to say, why does evil exist? Well, God may be all powerful, but God isn't necessarily all good, right? If God isn't all good, but God is still powerful, then you have a perfectly good explanation for why evil exists in this universe, despite the fact that God is all powerful, right? If God isn't all good, God just has a weird sense of humor and thinks it's funny. So this is an adequate solution for him, right? We go back to the problem of evil and say, all right, we'll mess around with what it means to be all good. Now we're going to look at messing around. This isn't really a very potent version or way of encountering it. You won't see a lot of arguments about maybe God isn't good. You might find a couple to say that, maybe goodness isn't what we think it means, but not a lot, really. I think most believers really want to accept that God is all good in a very general way that, is understandable by us all. There is a specific kind of category of theological study and writing which deals directly with the problem of evil, of trying to resolve the problem of evil. And the philosophers, or rather the theologians that are engaged in this, are called apologists. And this goes back to the Greek term of apology when it is meant as the word defense. So anyway, the next thing we want to look at is the other adequate solution that J.L. Mackie offers is, well, maybe it's the case that God is not all-powerful. God isn't as all-powerful in the way that we think God ought to be, and thus evil exists, in the things that, for whatever reason, God cannot change them. One of the first people that we see really getting this argument out there in a coherent form is this philosopher by the name of Averroes. Averroes is the, I guess, anglicized, westernized version of his name. He was Abu-l-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushdad, and I know I botched that. 12th century philosopher. Yes, he lived in, I think, what is now Spain. He was an Islamic scholar. He was also an Aristotelian scholar. And there's this kind of interesting story. I don't know that not as many people know about it as they should, right? So after the fall of the Roman Empire, we had the Romans protected and preserved and kept a whole lot of writings from the ancient Greeks and rewrote them and, basically republished them in their own way and passed them around and preserved them. But after the fall of Rome, some of the works of Aristotle were lost to Europe. Basically, people during the so-called Dark Ages were, generally much more interested in trying to stay alive than they were in necessarily preserving parchments and texts and things. Didn't have a lot of resources left over to do that. And, having a book wasn't enough. Every, I don't know, maybe every 100 years or so, you would have to rewrite the book to preserve it. It was made out of parchment. And of course, they didn't have, nice humidity-controlled glassed-in areas in which to keep their work, so it would deteriorate over time. And not all the time did it get to be rewritten. So there were major works of Aristotle that were lost. As the Dark Ages were ending, Western Europeans began to travel more and came back into contact and traded with the so-called East, right? Spain, Syria, Egypt, etc. Avicenna was in Persia. Anyway, there's several famous Islamic scholars that existed around that time. What we found was that there were Islamic scholars that during the Dark Ages had been able to maintain some of the works of Aristotle that the Western Europeans had lost. And they were, translated from the Greek into the Arabic, and, translated sometimes back into the Greek, sometimes into Latin, and were basically brought back into Europe from the Middle East. And then, well, Middle East is not fair, but from Spain at that time and other Islamic countries. So effectively, rescued Aristotle for us. In addition to having preserved the works of Aristotle, however, Averroes was a philosopher in his own right, a very good Aristotelian scholar, and posited some very interesting ideas about the nature of the world from Aristotle. And one of the ideas that he wrote about, that we still talk about today, is the idea that perhaps omnipotence doesn't mean what we think it does. This is called the paradox of omnipotence. The other thing is that Averroes, his writings and the translations of Aristotle came back into Western Europe, and the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, got a hold of these translations of Aristotle and really began to run with them. And his student, Thomas Aquinas, was very deeply informed by these writings of Aristotle and Averroes, writing a philosophy that was to become, and still is, the major philosophical structure for the Catholic Church. Okay, so paradox of omnipotence. A paradox is something, of course, that looks like it's contradictory and can't possibly be true, right? That there's two true premises, but if both of them are true, it doesn't seem to be possible. Can God truly do everything? Can God create a rock so big that God cannot lift it? If God can create a rock so big that God can't lift it, then there is a rock that is beyond God's own power. If God cannot create a rock so big that God cannot lift it, then there's something else that's beyond God's power. God can't create that rock. So this seems to, point to a potential problem with our ideas of omnipotence when we say, well, God can do anything. And I think that there's room to argue that perhaps Mackey's interpretation of, God being able to do everything, that might be faulty here. Thomas Aquinas, from Averroes, stated that God can do all things that are possible, that there are some things that are impossible for God to do. And really, that's not as weird a thought as it might seem. If we imagine for a moment that what's really happening here is that we're asking God to do something that's impossible because we are not complete. We are not completely intelligent. Our language is flawed such that we can formulate these questions, but at least into God's mind, they really don't make sense. So maybe syntactically we can say, can God create a rock so big that God can't lift it? In the same way that we can say, green ideas sleep furiously. Syntactically, green ideas sleep furiously, kind of works. However, the thought behind it is completely incoherent, I hope. And if it makes sense to you, you're not getting enough sleep. Okay, so maybe when some of the things that we're asking God for God to do in the service of eliminating evil and suffering is not logical. So imagine, a child comes up to you with a dead animal, a dead bird, and they say, fix it to you. You can't fix it, right? It's dead. Nothing you can really do to bring it back to life. Unless you were Dr. Frankenstein, but never mind. But, you can't. The kid is making a mistake in thinking that a bird is the kind of thing that you can bring back to life, right? That you can fix in the same way that you can put new batteries into a toy and make it run again. that we're asking God to do things that aren't logically possible, but we can't see that because we are, as human beings, limited. So when we ask that God, save us from every possible harm, save us from every injury, save us from untimely death, and so on, maybe there's something about the nature of the universe and the nature of God's power that this is simply impossible. So this is one of the ways that theologians and apologists have tried to wrestle with the idea of the problem of evil. So this is the second of the acceptable solutions for J.L. Mackie. So we start here, right? God is omnipotent. Well, and God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. So for J.L. Mackie, there's two adequate solutions where if we're willing to accept the idea that God is not all omnipotent, or we are willing to accept the idea that God is not wholly good, then the existence of evil does not require an explanation, in the world of an all-good, all-powerful God. It's not inconsistent anymore. So that's what he says are the adequate solutions. The other possibility is, of course, that God does not exist. For Mackie, actually, at the very beginning of the reading, he says not only that is it illogical for people to think that, God exists in the face of the problem of evil, he thinks it's actually positively irrational. That there's something wrong with you and your logic if you think that it's possible to believe in God in the presence of evil in the world. Okay, I think this is a good place to stop. Next time we're going to take a look at Gottfried Leibniz and what he had to say. So that'll be lecture 2.